My name's John Brindle. I'm in cohort 14 of the e-research and TEL program at Lancaster. I'm joined by Puyin Wong, who's also part of the same cohort, Francie Deluc, who is also part of the same cohort, and Tom. So it just leaves me to introduce our wonderful guest today, who is Dr. Phil Moffitt, who is a senior lecturer from the professional engineering wing from the Royal School of Military Engineering. And he also is a lecturer on the e-research and TEL PhD program at Lancaster.
Hello everyone, it's nice to see you all, whether you're on the call or catching up on a recording later. It's an honour to be in such good company. I doff my hat to Puyin, John and Francie and Tom for getting this great initiative going. I think it's fair to say a lot of us are currently researching in one way or another with the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster University. For interest, I was on cohort 8 of the doctoral programme, so I finished in 2019. I should also say that we're going to do a little bit of a quiz along the way. It's a special pub quiz round. It's the Technology Enhanced Learning Scholarship versus TEL Myths pub quiz round, which is rather a sad reflection of what pubs will be like if we ran them, I suppose. I'd actually love a TEL-themed pub. But anyway, if you win the quiz, there'll be a great mystery prize to follow. To enter, you just need a way of recording a few short answers to TEL-related questions. So I'll ask them every few minutes. So you've got a few minutes to get something to take notes on before the first question. As you heard, I'm a teaching-focused senior lecturer with a great organisation called MKC Training. I work predominantly at the Royal School of Military Engineering, where I also research technology-enhanced learning practice with colleagues. I'm also an independent consultant, but in a disciplinary focused area of TEL to do with organisational practice, socio-cultural things. I do things like identifying single points of failure and critical national infrastructure and how TEL could be a factor in that. I suspect there's little to no interest at all today in that, but I just thought I should mention it. To be honest, my biggest concern is that this might not be what you expected, so hopefully you don't have too many hardened expectations. If it suits, I'll spend around 40 minutes speaking about a few things. Puyin kindly gave me a potential structure short, so I'll use that. I'll break it into thirds, a little bit of background on how I got here. The middle will be the bulk of it, what I did on the PhD programme, bringing me up to today, and then the last third, finishing off what I've got on next. If I do a poor job of explaining anything, please do shout at me or ask the conveners to shout at me or type into the comments box. And if I don't notice, just shout at me, if that's okay. So question 1 first with a clue, first name and last name. Who coined the unhelpful and contested terms digital natives and digital immigrants? And if you like anagrams, you might be able to work it out there. You've probably got enough time to Google it and cheat if you want to do that. You'll know you cheated, but there we are. So we'll move on in 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There we are then. I'll go into a little bit about where I'm from. I've been advised that my social background and previous career might be relevant to my attitudes to work and learning, if nothing else to the way I approach TEL research and scholarship. I was born in 1972 in Birkenhead in Merseyside. It's a shipbuilding town, or was. With support in heavy industries, I lived with my grandparents, assuming like the majority of people around me on those estates that I'd enter shipbuilding or something related to shipbuilding. In those social circumstances, I have to say further education and higher education weren't discussed as an option. They weren't discussed and then dismissed. They just weren't discussed at all in our home life. Unfortunately for my school year, the shipbuilding sites of Camel Laird and the related heavy industries, they were hit hard in the 80s by those fully throttling Thatcherite and Reaganist policies of privatisation. My grandfather died before I left school, and that home just needed another wage coming in as soon as I could work. So at the age of 16, I applied with the express permission of a legal guardian to join the British Army, which you could back then. Fortunately for me, I was accepted as an army apprentice and I left home to join the Corps of Royal Engineers. I was incredibly well managed as a professional soldier. I responded well to discipline and routine and physical hardship, but I also responded well to the training and education opportunities that were offered. I should probably note that with that background and without a university education, I was only ever going to be a soldier, not an officer. I don't know why sometimes that surprises people, that back then you would never have been an officer without a degree, an accent and a social background. That I didn't have those things. I also didn't want to be an officer, not that that matters because I wouldn't have been one, but I didn't want to be one anyway. Anyway, after a few years of enjoying soldiering, I attended and passed a 2-year program of learning in things like power, water supply, sanitation. It was mapped to a higher national diploma, and we learned how to do things like design and build hospitals, disaster relief, sanitation, flood defences, that kind of thing. I went on to specialise in water and sanitation for humanitarian tasks, and how learning with local people can help those things. There might be people on the call who will balk at the idea that military engineers can be described in any way as humanitarian, and I'd welcome that debate, but maybe not today. We'll keep it to TEL if that's okay. So moving along a little bit, after a lot of travel and fulfillment, in 2010, aged 38, and with a couple of years left to serve in military engineering, I was appointed to a role called Sergeant Major Instructor, right? Somehow by osmosis, that supposedly gave me an understanding of how to design, deliver and manage TEL. I should probably note there, I intend that tone to be critical, not cynical. Like all branches of UK defence, the Royal Engineers invest a huge amount of time and effort in training and developing people, but it also tends to assume competency based solely on rank, which is flawed. So I wanted to see how it was done by the professionals. So at 38 years young, I walked into a physical university for the first time. By then I had an absolute basket case of a CV, like many military people. I had a sort of patchwork collection of modules from the Open University, whichever ones kind of fitted on the operational tours I was on. I had a few vocational qualifications, prior learning from chartered management institutions, and mosaic really of things like that. Fortunately for me, a very kind head of school loaded me onto one of her part-time MSc programs at the School of Engineering at the University of Greenwich. I absolutely devoured that, loved it. I have to say it was an MSc in engineering management, but I moulded it to fit a TEL research and scholarship agenda. And I just spent 2 years in awe at the buildings, the spaces, the people. I then went on to do a PGCHE. That was at the University of Kent. That was probably the first critical encounter I ever had with the notion of TEL. The first time that I'd been empowered to see it as anything other than a panacea for all the world's ills. The first time anyone had ever said, actually, this might not be all that we're saying it is. So that was great. And then at 40, I was offered work as a lecturer and went back to the Royal School of Military Engineering, where I've stayed since. Before I move on, I was tempted to describe that as maybe an unconventional background for a TEL researcher. I can't. That's disingenuous, it's lazy, and it's presumptuous, because who among us has a conventional background as a TEL researcher anyway? And when I was even toying with the idea of saying that, Puyin kind of put me right back in my place and said, we're so diverse. We've all got different backgrounds. So I started the PhD in 2015. At the time, I was lecturing small groups of defence engineers and technicians, still at the Royal School of Military Engineering. You can see the sort of place it is on the imagery there. You can see the Colonel-in-Chief visiting Her Majesty the Queen, which I'm sure you'll be overjoyed about if you're a Republican. A few thousand learners come through a year. There are around 160 of us who are teaching and learning staff, around 24 of us in a small higher education wing where I work. So I deliver undergraduate, postgraduate and executive education in things like energy management, facilities management, water supply, sanitation, a bit of consultancy in single points of failure, but also how technology enhanced learning and education in a broader sense can help with those things. So for as long as I can remember, certainly post MSc, I wanted to pursue a doctorate in TEL really, rather than engineering. I do love engineering. And I think people who I work with, they probably say I'm all right at it. But the reason I jump out of bed and skip into work is the scholarship of TEL rather than engineering. So around about 2015, I remember thinking, right, time's time I'm going to have to do this. I called the Department for Educational Research at Lancaster University, felt a bit of an idiot. Alice answered the phone. I literally said to Alice, we've never met. I really want to do a PhD in TEL. I'm not really sure what you do. Who do you speak to? Will you even have me? If so, what do I do? And it just went from there, really. I felt like I was pushing on an open door. That certainly helped. I think most of us here are probably familiar with that PhD program, or we've heard of it at least. But if you're on it, you might not be aware of how the welcome you receive there does stand in stark contrast to many other PhDs. I had colleagues who said, I can't believe you've just been welcomed like that. You know, I had no kind of help at all. I had nobody even to speak to. I was just writing letters and not even hearing anything back. Anyway, a few months later, I found myself amongst friends in cohort 8. I have to say most of them were more advanced, more focused, certainly better educated. I mean that sincerely, not false modesty. They really were better educated, but they were also incredibly patient with me. Some were absolute heroes. People like Tundi, who you've had on previously, also really great staff members, the likes of Sue Cranmer, Brett Blythe, Don Passy, loads of people like that who just put time and effort into helping idiots like me when they don't have to, right? I remember Paul Ashwin telling us quite early, it was on a residential, something I really needed to hear. I can't remember his exact words, but it's something like, you know, perseverance trumps all, or something like that. That made me feel better, because I thought, actually, maybe I can compensate for this lack of sort of academic application with just a work ethic, with just belligerence, and just keep going. And that was music to my ears, so I might be able to do that. I think you're probably interested in progression through the modules, so I'll skip through those. But before I do, see if you can do question 2 there. So in 1994, 101 studies were reviewed in a meta-analysis to confirm that there was no consistent evidence of an inventory of what? And a little clue, sometimes known as VARK, visual aural reading kinesthetic. And we'll move along in 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's fast enough to Google, isn't it? Okay, so module 1 was all about research methods. I did a phenomenographic study of the mediation of TEL. When I look back at that now, it looks incredibly naive, but at the time I was really chuffed with it. It was like my first grown-up report in TEL or something. I did end up publishing this, but it was in a very defence-oriented publication called the Royal Engineers Journal. I'm not sure anybody who ever read the Royal Engineers Journal cared what I had to say about the mediation of TEL. And I'm not sure everyone who ever cared about the mediation of TEL has ever read the Royal Engineers Journal, but I was really proud. Phenomenography examines conceptions of phenomena rather than phenomena themselves, you know. So I decided to find out what colleagues thought of the mediation of TEL. Believe it or not, that was a novel approach. Nobody had ever asked. UK Defence back then, it kind of imported and extrapolated TEL policy and practice from US Defence, but on a lower budget. So there was a lot of will, there was a lot of good intentions, but people really were just trying things under centralised control. Coincidentally, I was just remembering earlier, when I wrote that first paper, I went to see a military strategist just to speak to him about it. And he told me in no uncertain terms I'd have a short future if he ended up with, you know, 50 Marxists running around the place demanding changes to everything. That's nice, isn't it? So that just kind of made me a bit more stubborn, I suppose. If you know phenomenography, you'll see the sense making and meaning making on that slide there. Just let me put a quick highlighter on this cursor for you. So this conception at number 5, it includes all the previous conceptions from 1 to 4. Okay, so you don't need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then to 5. You can jump around to suit the social conditions you're faced with, but you also don't need to go through them. You can just jump from 2, you can jump to 5, you can do whatever you want. So phenomenography is quite good at exposing things like that. That was quite a finding where I work and learn. It might not be for many of you. Some of you might be rolling your eyes and thinking this is incredibly basic, but I really did have to break that to people with a lot of sensitivity, that TEL wasn't the devices that were in the cupboards or on the desks or screwed to the wall. TEL was an activity, it was a practice, it was something we did, not something that we'd bought. It had qualitative meaning, there were problems, there were debates, people were using it to shape learning and developing others, and those material things, they mediated something which was much broader and complex, and it was that thing they were mediating that was actually TEL rather than the devices. I know that might seem a bit silly to a lot of you, but it was a big thing. So for module 2, you can see in the title there, I fluctuated between literature review, case study, literature review, case study. Settled on a modest case study with a few colleagues in my own team. I was struggling at this point with things like ontology, epistemology, methodology. It wasn't a particularly impactful piece per se. It was after the residential, so I was getting a little bit more confident, but still had me stabilizers on, or training wheels if you prefer. I was hand-railing a lot of authors, not just to see what those experienced TEL researchers had done, but also how they did it, and kind of playing around with that. I knew things like ontology and epistemology were important because I could hear everyone talking about them, but I didn't really understand what I was supposed to be doing with them, what I was supposed to write. To be honest, I probably just wanted somebody clever to sit me down and say, look, here's a paragraph, just write that and you'll be fine, and then just move on. Kind of defeats the object to do that, because we have to swim around in these issues, don't we, to understand them and to understand how they do fundamentally affect our identities and preferred methodologies and everything like that. I should probably also say I didn't go along with all of my own ideas. I exposed all these magical things. 10 minutes after writing that stuff on the screen there, I'd have had another fantastic career-defining idea. I was very much in the ideas generating factory, saying, oh, I know, I'll do this in all the other modules, and then in part 2, and I'll dine out on it for life, and I'll be talking at TEL centres all over the world and on TED Talks and cruise ships and everything. And then, oh no, I just found a paper and somebody did it 20 years ago. So that's a non-starter. I was very much in that sort of mindset, you know. Okay, I should note, not all my slides are just going to be a load of writing, okay, but by the end of the 3rd module, which was actually module 5, I know that's confusing, but some of you will know why, I think I'd moved past that ideas factory, the excited mindset. I still sometimes drift back to that. And I was moving beyond a kind of short phase of postmodernist hand-wringing as well. And I was starting to realise I wanted to change TEL for the better, rather than just keep writing about how unfair life is and all that stuff. Engels had this saying, didn't he, that freedom's the recognition of necessity, and that's probably where I was when I was writing that. Kind of encapsulates how I was starting to feel. So I was seeing these problems as an opportunity for research rather than a cause for complaint and moaning, really. Where I work as well, TEL at the time was still a euphemism for we've bought them, you'll have to use them now. That's pretty much what TEL policy was where I work. Look, we've bought all these things, you're going to have to use them. And if you hear things like that, you know, you've got a lot of research opportunities around you, don't you? So it was a positive. Back then as well, UK defence was struggling with this kind of state-sponsored, self-perpetuating, self-legitimised right to be different from society. So defence was incredibly worried about closer societal alignment. I don't really know why. It might not seem like it, but there are loads of implications there for intercultural and critical TEL. So I started to examine the history of TEL for defence. I find out that defence strategists for decades, if not centuries, have always harboured these histrionic concerns of societal influence. And yet, whenever society pushes in change, operational capabilities, fine, you know, it endures. So my discussion back then was that furthering intercultural development and introducing social antagonism would further improve military capability, and that's what we should start doing in TEL as well. So that was quite well received by the end, not necessarily at the start. In module 3, which was our 4th module, and I think it still is, I took a more interventionist approach. I was getting a bit braver. I was involving others in my madcap ideas. I was still having a few wobbles, but still had those great people around me. I set out to expose and aggravate primary contradictions in moving some residential TEL online. So I involved 6 learners in something called a change laboratory methodology, which you can see on the screen. So these are like, you know, task stimuli that you can see. You get people up and you get them to model and you get them to propose change and to understand the historical and cultural embeddedness and all that stuff. So to change laboratory methodology designed for commensurability with cultural and historical activity theory. So again, you can imagine how some people reacted to using a Marxist methodology in a military school, but it was worth it in the end. That study, it did empower people to identify and aggravate contradictions. We realized they were significant for developing TEL. We did directly relate those proposals for change with the interactions that had been enabled by technology, so that was great. And I think what was great about it for a lot of the participants, it showed them that these studies aren't just sitting on leather Chesterfield settees pontificating. You can actually just roll your sleeves up and do something to change TEL activity. If you ever want to do that, I'd recommend cultural and historical activity theory in the change laboratory methodology. There's a lot of theoretical swatting to do, expansive learning, transformative agency, and double stimulation at the very least, but it's well worth it. And those participants did embrace an active role in their own development of TEL. So it also normalized things like resistance and criticism and social antagonism. It challenges the pretense of managerial consensus. The people I work with, I think most people are the same. It just don't wash if you say, well, we're all entitled to our opinions. Isn't this jolly nice that we get along? Let's agree to disagree. Now we need to do X, Y, and Z. That pretense of consensus, to me, it isn't any better than threats and coercion. In fact, in some ways it's worse, because at least threats and coercion are open. This pretense of managerial consensus, to me, can be worse, because you kind of pretend and we all agree when in fact we don't. So that pretense of consensus is openly confronted with the change lab methodology. It's not for everyone, though. In module 4, which was our 5th module and the last in part 1, I took a more contentious turn. I exposed a few non-conformances. We found that people were capricious as in rule bending. They were capriciously rule bending and rule breaking. They were surreptitiously setting up their own network learning communities, which is an odd thing to see. This was all happening kind of sub rosa or under the radar, as they describe it. These people weren't calling the expansive endeavours network learning communities. They simply wouldn't have said that, would they? But when we took a theoretical and scholarly approach, it showed us that's exactly what they were setting up, and they were doing it right underneath the boss's noses to explain there are policies in defence that people will only use defence IT infrastructure, architecture, platforms and media for work and learning. Which is kind of pragmatic for security, but it's an absolute nuisance if you want to show some, a YouTube video and animation. You just can't do it. You just can't get it through that defence filter. Also, defence policy states that people can only learn things from other people who are directly sponsored and appointed by UK defence. So it seems reasonable and pragmatic, if a little bit constraining, but those rules just aren't followed. They haven't been followed for years, and yet there's still rules. So you can imagine how something begins as an occasional infraction and then it just becomes the accepted norm, and we're all breaking rules and not really remembering what the rules were in the first place. There's quite a tradition of rule bending and rule breaking for soldiers, not just in TEL, but in life in general. You'll probably sense there's a relationship with agency as well that a lot of you will recognise. But the point of that research was for us to find out how and why learners were breaking rules, and we found it wasn't just for the sake of breaking rules. It was to set up and sustain their own very illicit, right, but also very effective weak-tied network learning communities. So that was fascinating, and by that point I was well and truly emerged in all the messiness and chaos and problematic issues of research, activity theory, expansive learning, double stimulation, transformative agency. I was having an occasional peek behind the curtain as well. So I was actually finding that these people, these big names, these big hitters, and Engerstrom, Blunden, Spinuzzi, all seminal writers, they were incredibly busy pulling each other's work apart too, almost to breaking point, and their own work, pulling their own work apart too. And they were always finding weak points and blind spots. And I always found that incredibly reassuring about activity theorists, that they're actually the biggest critics of activity theory. So there was something reassuring about that. So just before I go on to part 2, let's see if you can have a go at that one. what's the blanked out word? The left half of the blank is analytical and the right half is creative. And we'll move on in 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so in part 2, module 6, I did an 18-month change lab intervention, and that was empowering participants to redesign their own boundary crossing TEL. You can probably see how that built on previous projects for me. I don't think many people did that. I think most people probably entered, at least our cohort, with significantly more focus than I ever had. I really did just learn from each successive kind of module. So for part 2, I'd learned a lot from previous projects, not just learned in the sense that, you know, discussions, conclusions, feedback, feed forward, but I'd also learned things that we'd never write down. We might talk about them over a pint, but we wouldn't write them down. You know, what was possible, what was a ridiculous idea, what I should have really known earlier than I did, who I wanted to be supervised by, who I didn't, but I probably would have pushed, all that kind of stuff, you know. So guided by activity theory, a Marxist epistemology to take ownership of change, and a change laboratory methodology, we did a research intervention. There were 10 military learners, 6 civilian lecturers and 3 military managers. And that really was socially antagonistic, very much indeed. So we looked hard at our own sort of cultural and historical embeddedness of TEL. In many ways, TEL was still set up to learn about kind of symmetrical wars of the last century. But in this century, we had to prepare these people for, you know, building Ebola treatment units in Sierra Leone, leading on flood defences and Nightingale hospitals for COVID, hurricane relief in the Caribbean. And those roles were entirely different from the system that they were trying to use to learn, really. So I think it was 14 sessions, 2 follow-up workshops. Those participants really did redesign the collaborative change in a sustainable way. They changed their own TEL activity by first critiquing its historical evolution, which was really important because that led to them negotiating its sustainability. If they changed, would it just spring back when the backs were turned, kind of thing? But then enacting and testing proposals to change, so like these long-term expansive cycles, that's still being consolidated now, particularly the rules and the division of labour. They were radically reinvented, to be frank. So that approach kind of, it showed us that it was the social and cultural mediators that we had to prioritise rather than technological artefacts. For us here, it wasn't media and platforms creating problems. It really wasn't. It was how we used them. It was the contradictions of policy. It was the stakeholder influences. It was this horizontal division of labour, which was happening whenever anyone's back was turned. And those ripples are still felt now. So that was incredibly rewarding, but also quite high risk for some of the participants to do that. So next we've got, that wasn't a very elegant segue, was it? Next we've got question 4. In 2010, the Reader's Digest claimed that 1 in 3 children no longer does what? The claim was later debunked. So a scholarly approach found that children were still doing it, but they were doing it differently. It is a very clean and wholesome answer if you're thinking of anything else. We'll move on in 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, look, we're nearly there now. Just imagine someone's dropped an ice cube down your back. That helps. That'll help you now. You have a nice little stretch. So at the moment, I'm mentoring a few scholars on engineering social mobility programs, doing a bit of PhD supervision with partnered institutions, carrying on with those what I'd describe as expansive approaches to change in TEL, always with participants, almost always with participants themselves. Those expansive approaches, they're not for everyone. The theory can be very esoteric. The outcomes can take years to emerge, so they need patience. more often than not, I'm invited or asked. So quite often asked to help a specific group. Could be teachers, lecturers, support staff, learners, managers, or all of those groups who've kind of got problems with TEL, but don't really know how to explicate those problems, let alone solve them. So that's great. I do know, I'm conscious that, you know, on this call, I know that makes me a very lucky researcher indeed. I've got little in terms of top-down research mandates, next to no pressure to fit in with like refable profiles. Nobody's taking my pulse every 5 minutes. Most of the time, I'm managed by great people who just genuinely appreciate being part of that interventionist research. So it's a great place to work and learn. But equally, it wouldn't be for me if I was asked to, you know, go and see how this TPAC or SAMA model fits a department or other. No offence if that's what you do. It's very valuable stuff, but personally for me, it's not what I'd prefer. I'd prefer to just saying, come on, this isn't good enough. We've got to do something about this. Why can't people pull out a smartphone and video their own learning? Why can't somebody contact somebody outside this institution and ask for help with learning? How can we change those things for the better? How can we help colleagues, as in lecturers, to not feel threatened by things like that? So most of the projects I'm doing, they're interventionist research to develop TEL. I occasionally use phenomenography, occasionally use a case study, but that's usually to expose other opportunities. So that leads me on to the support of the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning. But before we do, we've just got a last question of our 5. According to the Archimedean myth, what's the name of this phenomenon where in workplaces we learn 70% informally, 20% from peers and 10% formally? What's the metaphor that's often used? The clue is it's cold, and I'd be surprised if Archimedes ever saw one, but maybe he did. And we'll move on in 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so just looking ahead while you think of any questions and before we mark your quizzes, nearly there. One thing I'm examining soon is a study and replication of kind of physical co-present methodologies to online settings. So something like online change labs for research interventions into online practice, which sounds grand. Do you know, I recently did a change lab with a group of fairly senior people, and they wanted to enact change to online learning. But they wanted the change lab to be physically co-present, even though the activity they wanted to change was online. So that's a challenge I'm going to look into. Why would that be? I'm also really interested. This is probably where a few of you will also have noticed something. I'm really interested in how we return from emergency remote teaching to unpicking all of those things that were done at pace in an emergency by colleagues who just had to work really fast under great pressure to get a load of content onto a VLE, things that I think really are at risk of just being embedded as the norm. They were never meant to be like that. They were meant to be for an emergency. And I do think there's a huge risk for us that we might be assuming that we've got online learning when we simply haven't. What we've got is emergency remote teaching that was never revisited. It was never meant to be like that. And it's just going to become the way that we do things. Still a bit unsure and tentative how to feel legitimate making claims like that. That seems quite a bold claim to make, so that makes me feel a bit unsteady. I've got mentorship and support at CTEL at Lancaster and EDRES more broadly. It's one of the few places I've been where people are confident and credible enough to just say, you know, I have absolutely no idea. It's a very rare thing for me. It's not something you often hear in my line of work. A lot of people just invent and lie or bluff, and they do so with such bravado that they're believed. So I like that about CTEL and EDRES, is that people will acknowledge the kind of partiality of knowledge and they'll follow up with you. They'll say, let's find out why, see if anyone else has done it. So I think I'll be saying thank you to the people there forever, probably. But take, for example, the people who put together this today, the people who put resources on CTEL channels for the rest of us, the people who put together a TEL Researchers series, the people who went through that Herculean effort of starting the journal studies in TEL. They didn't do it for themselves. These people aren't doing it for themselves. So I'm getting to know more and more nice people as I go on. Like most of us, I've got a load of papers and chapters in various states. I've got a few rejection emails that I need to stop sulking about, but I'm not going to stop sulking for another few days yet. I don't think it's right, like all of us, how we deal with rejection. So I've got to just come to terms with that. And I know I've got to stop sulking, but I'm not going to stop sulking just yet. And a few other challenges. I've got a lot to be enthused about, working and learning with a wonderful bunch of people in cohort 15. I'm learning a lot from you all, a lot of what you might call reverse mentoring, I suppose, and I'll be eternally grateful to you for your enthusiasm. And I'm joining cohort 14 for the back end of module 4, I think towards the end of September. So in the next year or so, I'm also moving away from where I currently work, and I'll be relocating. So I'll probably be in a position to do a bit more, peer reviewing, mentoring, collaborative research, maybe conferences, things like that. At the minute, it's quite hard to schedule around some of the work I do. That work tends to be fixed in time, and my time moves around these heavily scheduled military projects, But that'll be a wrench leaving here. It's something I've got to do, and it'll be a great adventure, but it'll also be a wrench. Let's do some marking. You ready? So we'll get a nice big mystery prize, and then we'll have a look at some of these questions. A point for each correct answer. If you think you deserve half a mark, just give yourself half a mark. Nobody's going to ask for proof. You'll know you've cheated. Because question 1, the myth of digital natives, was, of course, Mark Prensky. Question 2 was learning styles. Interestingly, VARC is one of 107 models of learning styles. There's a learning styles challenge with a cash reward if you can prove it empirically. But guess what? You can't. Question 3 is the brain, the myth of left-brained and right-brained people. Question 4 was reading. And question 5 was the iceberg model. I think because 70% of an iceberg is underwater, which is also a myth, by the way. Okay, so what I'm going to do before we move on and just take any questions, just for fun, please don't overreact if you don't win. Do, and the winner is Geraldine. Well, that's quite nice, isn't it? So a round of applause. Geraldine. Okay, Geraldine, what we've got for you as a prize, and I'll get it over to you. I think I've got your email address already.
Phil, you can give me one-to-one on ontology, epistemology, and methodology.
Oh, you'll find somebody much better qualified than me. But I'll certainly signpost it.
I want to mess.
So this is what your prize will be. It's called a bog in a bag, and it's by WaterAid. And it'll help somebody, I think in Mali at the minute, get a life-saving latrine. So I'll make sure you get that wee gift card, and that'll come over to you later. Okay, well done. Round of applause for Geraldine. PhD bingo, that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? PhD bingo. Just like somebody else said, it's like making soup. Just sprinkle words like ontology and epistemology around, and people think you know what you're doing.
Does anyone have any questions for Phil? Are you happy to take some questions, Phil?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I'll ask you one, Phil. So coming into research, what did you think? What was your biggest challenge coming into research in the way that you did? Sorry, that's a really, really difficult question, but it'd be really interesting to know what you thought your biggest challenge was.
Do you mean in a very broad, holistic sense? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, just kind of what did you think? Kind of like, because you came from what you would call non-conventional kind of background, but what would you feel that your kind of biggest challenge in kind of undertaking research or coming into research was?
I think at this level it was people talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and it seems to me we've all got it. So what are we all imposters or something? Who doesn't have it? So I think it was probably that, but it was more about accepting that it wasn't just me, it was everyone. I remember somebody saying on one of those residentials, he ended up a good friend, like, and he just put his hand up, and it was just as I was about to put my hand up, and he just said, "I don't understand what any of you are talking about. I don't understand any of these words. I don't know what they mean. I just need you to stop saying them. And if I ask you what they mean, there's no point telling me louder what the same word is. I've just told you I don't know what it means." And I thought, when you looked around, the vast majority of people were in the same position. So it wasn't just one or two, it was the vast majority. And I think it was probably that. It was probably just getting over, that sense that you felt like you were the only one. I think that, I know it's probably a cliche, like John, but I think that sense of cohortness just does help with stuff like that. Because I remember talking to like work colleagues here who were on different PhDs, and they were saying, yeah, we're the same, but nobody's helping us. We're just getting thrown like really philosophical papers, and they know we're not from that background. And then when we meet up again, they're just saying the same words. So I think it was probably that, John. I think it was just getting over that, and then accepting that it wasn't supposed to be easy. It wasn't, you weren't missing out on some like secret code or shibboleth that everybody else had access to. It was just something you had to dive into and accept it as problematic, I think.
That's great. Thanks for that insight, Phil. That's great. Yeah, I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that definitely the cohort identity that we've kind of generated has been extremely useful for bouncing ideas off each other more than anything.
What was your biggest challenge,
I think do you know what? I'm going to probably, it sounds like a cop-out, but probably exactly the same thing as you. I find that in my day-to-day work life as well, that I kind of sometimes struggle to go, well, what, I come from a teaching background, but I think, how have I ended up working for a university,
Yeah, no, I do.
We sometimes feel like I've got here by mistake.
Yeah, how did I end up there? Yeah, I think when I go with Ellie to, like Howlett's wildlife parks around here, and I watch those gorillas swinging on a tire, and think that's what I should be doing. That's my rightful play.
But it's more fun.
Yeah, my grandmother used to have this saying that's not for people like us, Phil.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, she'd say things like, and I think it just stuck, and it got really sticky because it was said enough times that you started to believe it, that wasn't for people like us. So.
Well, Kwame, actually, just to kind of build on that, Kwame's asked a really interesting question. Okay. So what from your military background did you find most useful in academia?
Probably just tenacity, really, but I don't think the military background's got a monopoly on that. I think a lot of backgrounds have. The military is sometimes accredited with things as if it's got a monopoly on things like that, tenacity and teamwork and being there for the greater good. It's not a militarism. I think it's just sometimes because military activities are only really public when they encapsulate those things in one intense experience, that people think it's got some monopoly on it, and it hasn't. We've all kind of got that tenacity, but for me it would be that it just that sense that if you just keep digging in, eventually you'll get there. So thanks, Kwame. Thanks for the question.
Yes, it was a really good question. Sandra's also posted that she loved teaching MSA students from the Irish military because they took instruction well.
Yeah, they probably would take instruction well, yeah. And some of the people I work with here, they just want to be told. They'll be open with you. They'll say, I don't want to reflect. I don't want to be critical. I want you to just tell me how I need to pass. Because I want to get on, it's Friday afternoon and the roads are filling up. I don't want to be critical. I want to get going. It's a little bit heartbreaking, but also understandable.
Great. Has anyone else?
I've got a slightly unrelated question to your presentation, Phil, but we asked all sorts of random questions anyway in every single talk so far. So one of the key elements of our program, for those of you who don't know, is we do peer review quite a lot. And it's obviously a very important skill to have in the research world. But I think I can speak for a lot of people. I really struggle to be critical and being nice at the same time. I just wonder what's been your kind of journey from presumably not knowing how to do it to now. You mentioned, you do quite a bit of review for journals and stuff. What's your sort of journey from a novice to now an experienced reviewer? What advice do you have for us to be nice, not to be reviewer too? Is this what I'm trying to get to?
It's going to sound really condescending, but I would just write it as you want to receive it, irrespective of what you've had from other people. Somebody's got to break that chain. And if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? I think we've just got to break that chain and start reviewing in a manner which we'd be happy to receive reviews, which should really start off with, here's what I liked about your work. And then should probably end with, just to recap, I did enjoy reading the work. And then there's obviously got to be some filling in the famous sandwich, hasn't there? There's got to be some point where you actually say, there are opportunities to strengthen it. And this is, but even you could frame that as developmental and forward focused. You don't have to say, here's what I didn't like about it. You can frame it as, here's how to strengthen it, can't you? I think. I'll tell you who's really good at it. I think he might be on the call, is Brett. When you actually get Brett's feedback, you think, actually, all right, there's quite a lot of filling and a very thin bit of bread sometimes, but it is still structured as that sandwich. It's like, I liked a bit here. This is how to strengthen it. And just to recap, I liked this about it. And of course, when that relationship strengthens a bit, you can start chucking the bread away, can't you? But not when you first start, not when you don't even know somebody and you think, I don't know what environment they're going to read this in, what mindset they're going to have, what kind of day they've had. You've just got to defer to, how would I want to receive it? Having had a pretty ropey day and probably looking forward to opening that email. I sulk like Billy O'Coogan, honestly. I've got a few rejections here and I start to come to terms with them and then just start throwing things around. So I'm probably not the best to ask. We should start a little away day in the mountains, how to cope with desk rejections or something. How would you do it? What tips have you got?
I think it doesn't cost anything to be nice, does it? To people. That's really the. I think some people feel like you have to be really harsh to get through to people, but it actually doesn't cost anything to be nice to people, and you get just as much impact from being nice. In most cases, depends if you're teaching in a classroom full of 15-year-olds who don't want to be there. Then I suppose sometimes you've got to raise your voice.
Yeah.
I think there's a fine line between being nice and being critical, because it's so difficult. It's so easy to just tip over the balance to be seen as, are you being critical or are you just being nasty? But I guess it takes practice, doesn't it?
Yeah, you see a lot of people as well who frame something as critical and you think that's not critical, that's cynical. And they're very different things. They might almost be homophones, but they're very different things, being critical and being cynical, aren't they?
I think it's an overused phrase, I think, but we're always told in this job, educational development, that we're to be critical friends, so we're supposed to be supportive and offer that criticality on what they're doing, but do it in a supportive manner. It's not just saying this is rubbish. It's saying, I think you could improve this, but here's how you could improve it.
Yeah. And this here, I don't know if this is is this queuing me up for providing feedback on module 4 or something?
Absolutely not.
Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody. And thanks again, Phil. Just offer our warmest thanks and a big round of applause to you for sharing your background and your approaches to research with us. That was great. Even Brett's giving you a round of applause. He's even turned his camera on to give you a round of applause.
High praise, isn't it? High praise indeed. He's probably trying to catch a fly or something.
But no, thank you so much. We do really appreciate your insight and just learning from you about your roots into what you're doing.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
It was